automated vehicle technology, and people with disabilities. My name is Robert Puentes. I'm the President and CEO of the Eno Center for Transportation. I want to let you know this webinar will be recorded, transcribed, and uploaded for those who are not able to join or who are hearing impaired. And joining us today here in our office in Washington are our friends from Securing America's Future Energy, also known as SAFE, and the National Federation for the Blind. The focus is on how AVs offer increased independence for people with disabilities by reducing existing barriers to transportation. And we'll get into a report that SAFE produced earlier this year for the Ruderman Family Foundation on self-driving cars and the impact on people with disabilities. They're here to talk about the content of the active legislation on AVs that's currently before Congress, as well as discuss what the next steps are going to be with that whole process. And so joining us here today in our offices here at the Eno Center is Amitai Bin Nun, the Vice President for Autonomous Vehicles and Mobility Innovation at SAFE, and Dylan Hetler-Gadet, the Government Affairs Specialist at the National Federation for the Blind. Amitai and Dylan are going to walk us through the basics of the report, as well as their perspectives and experiences on this important topic. We'll then have plenty of time for questions at the end. So for those listening in, you're encouraged to submit questions and comments via the questions function on the webinar website. You don't have to wait until they're finished with their presentations to submit questions. You can submit that at any time. I think we're going to find this conversation really interesting and timely, and I want to thank you all again for participating and joining us here today. With that, take it away, Dylan.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. I just want to start off by introducing y'all briefly to the National Federation of the Blind. We are the largest and oldest organization of blind people in the country. We have affiliates and chapters in all 50 states, as well as in the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. Our mission is to advance and promote opportunities for blind people all over the country and all over the world. We do so through advocacy efforts, through educational programming, through research into technology. We provide free canes to all blind people who want to use them, and we are very much a pro-Braille organization. We have been in this space in particular around transportation and autonomous vehicles for a long time. We believe that autonomous vehicles have the potential to unlock gains in things like productivity and employment for people with disabilities broadly, but for blind people specifically. So that's why we're very excited about this legislation and about this technology. One thing I would like to direct you all to is the Blind Driver Challenge. That is an indication of where the National Federation of the Blind has been in the space of technology, transportation, and driving. It's very interesting, and I think you'll all enjoy taking a look at that.
Well, thank you, Dylan. Thank you very much, Rob, and the Eno staff for having us. We're really honored to be a part of this webinar. So my role at SAFE is to lead our efforts to accelerate the deployment of autonomous vehicles and maximize the benefits that they offer society. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit about SAFE and how we came to be in this role in Washington to help work with regulators, legislators, and the broader public to help accomplish these goals. SAFE was founded in 2004 by the CEO of FedEx, Fred Smith, and the former commander of the Marine Corps, P.X. Kelly. And it was founded in the wake of the Iraq War to improve U.S. energy security. SAFE believes that oil security is national security, and oil security is economic security. So we improve our national welfare by improving our energy security. And we've supported a range of policies that will help improve energy security, both on the supply side and by increasing our supply to domestic oil and by reducing our consumption. We are incredibly excited about autonomous vehicles because we think it is the most incredible opportunity to improve our energy security by remaking our transportation system in a more efficient and less oil-dependent way. We're already seeing lots of companies who are deploying autonomous vehicles based on electric drivetrains or plug-in hybrid drivetrains. And we think there's lots of opportunities around using shared models to deploy more efficient vehicles. And we may get a little bit more into depth in that if there are some questions about that. But I think when we zoom back and we work with legislators and regulators, we need to tell a broader story. And we need to talk about why this is important to society and how this makes a difference. And we need to get as broad a lens as possible on this. And we need to talk about the safety implications of autonomous vehicles, how they can save lives on the road, the economic implications, and we do a lot of work on that. And most of all, we're really proud to work with Dylan and the NFB to rebuild our mobility system in an accessible way that offers equal access to transportation for everyone.
That's great. So tell us a bit about the report that was released earlier this year. So obviously all this with autonomous vehicles is there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of interest in this now. You put the report earlier this year that was focused on this topic. Tell us a little bit about what was in that report.
Sure, no, thank you. So we released a report this past January talking about some of the challenges that people with mobility, people with disabilities face in our transportation system and how autonomous vehicles could be a solution to some of those problems. And we started off by talking about where there are some of the shortfalls in our current system. 1 in 5 people across the United States has a disability, and about 20% of that number report significant problems in accessing the mobility they need to accomplish the life, to have the life that they want to have, and to have access to the opportunities, both social and economic, that they would like to. And frankly, that's not something that should happen. The American with Disabilities Act enshrines into law right to equal access to transportation, but the reality is that public transportation is not fully accessible. It's difficult to drive a private vehicle if you have to retrofit it, or if you have a disability that prevents you from driving it. And paratransit, even paratransit services are expensive and not fully reliable. So the fact is that people with disabilities don't have equal access to transportation. So we then took a look as to, well, how could autonomous vehicles help, and what are some of the key benefits that we might see? We did some modeling of unemployment rates amongst people with disabilities, and we showed that there will be up to 2 million job opportunities that would be accessible to people with disabilities if they would have access to better transportation. And we found that there were about 11 million medical appointments missed by people with disabilities because they had inadequate access to transportation, and that leads to lots of costs down the road, because if someone can't make it to the doctor, they end up having a more expensive complication down the line. And then our report transition said, well, we have this problem that we think autonomous vehicles could solve and deliver lots of benefits to society. Here's what we should do. Here's what we need to do as members of the disability community, as government officials, and as local transportation officials. Here's a series of recommendations that we then make for each of these parties to do in order to help make sure that autonomous vehicles realize the opportunity that they present, and it doesn't become a missed opportunity for people with disabilities.
And how well do you think the congressional debate is addressing these concerns? Maybe Dylan, is this part of the discussion, or is it still driven by other interests?
I would say the answer to your question is yes and no. We, for example, the National Federation of the Blind, we have had tremendous luck and we've had excellent outcomes when it comes to the conversation that's being had on the Senate side of the legislative debate. We've had a lot more willing partners on the Senate, particularly those on the Senate Commerce Committee who were responsible for putting this bill together. On the House side, less so, and we're often left in a position where we're quote-unquote given something, like, for example, in the House bill, we're given a federal advisory committee, and then we're sort of left to the side of the debate from that point on. As I said, on the Senate, there was much more substantive engagement. They do recognize our concerns around, for example, discriminatory licensing practices, which could prevent us from having legal access to autonomous vehicles. They've been very receptive to our concerns around the human-machine interface questions. So human-machine interface is basically, how do you get into an autonomous vehicle and interact with it? How do you tell it where to go? So I would say that it's a mixed bag. There are plenty of staffers on Capitol Hill who understand what our concerns are, what our needs are, but we are just one among many kind of constituencies and interest groups who are trying to influence the outcomes in the debate.
Sure. Yeah, there seems to be a lot of voices now in this. But so it's licensing and the human interface, machine interface. Those are the big concerns, the big recommendations from the report and from your federation.
As far as for blind people specifically, and that's really only who I can speak for here in my capacity with the National Federation of the Blind, making sure that there are no discriminatory licensing practices. So, for example, we were very adamant about pushing for the prevention of, let's say, an acuity test. Like if you think about the way that a traditional license now, driver's license, is awarded to someone or issued to someone, you have to pass an eye exam, right? So we were concerned that what would happen is local and state entities would just use the same kind of system they had in place around traditional driver's licenses when they were trying to issue the operator licenses to autonomous vehicles, and that would, of course, explicitly block out blind people. So we were trying to push against that. And then the human-machine interface, yes. How are we going to, say, call a car in the context of a fleet model, ride sharing? How are we going to get the car to us? Then how are we going to get to the car? How are we going to tell the car where to go and what to do? That's all a matter of HMI, human-machine interface, and the technology is out there. We just need to make sure that manufacturers and technology developers are thinking about that stuff when they're putting these vehicles together.
Got it. Dylan, I really appreciate your point about the Senate bill versus the House bill, and some of it has to do with the process that's been happening on Capitol Hill. The House went first and passed the bill in July. It actually passed in early September. It passed through the entire House, and the Senate bill wasn't reported out of committee until October. Right now, we're still waiting for the entire Senate to pass their version of the self-driving car bill, and right now there are some holds on it, but there's reason for optimism that will happen in some form sooner or later. But perhaps because the Senate bill went second, it actually was able to go into a lot more depth on some of the provisions that are important to people with disabilities, and therefore some of their approaches are more. There are more measures that specifically address the conversation that we're having here, and it does so in a way that is better developed. So, for example, both bills would leave the right to license drivers to states, whereas the safety of the autonomous vehicles to be regulated by the federal government. However, the Senate bill also includes a provision that says states in their regulation of driver licensing cannot discriminate against people with disabilities, and that's something that's really important because that's the whole benefit. That's the whole promise of autonomous vehicles is around being able to get from place A to place B without a licensed driver in the vehicle, and therefore offering access to people who don't have the ability to get a driver's license because of their disability. And there's also several other provisions which really makes it clear that the Senate bill is baking the principle of accessibility into their regulatory approach. They specifically have a working group, and they create this working group to help create regulations because no one at this point knows how to regulate autonomous vehicles. So the way the Senate bill approaches it is it creates this committee to come up with the approach and give recommendations to the government agencies that are responsible for making the regulations. And there's a specific working group in that committee that is addressing accessibility, and they are charged with recommending to NHTSA how accessibility can be baked into the regulations from the get-go. And there are several other committees, and I realize committees can be just committees, but particularly in the Senate bill, there's a relatively delimited number of committees which are set up to be more influential, and there are places for disability advocacy groups at that table, and I think that's a really important thing to happen.
So your point about the federal bill leaving some of this to the states potentially, are there states that are leading this? Are there places outside of Washington that you think are more advanced on this, that are thinking about this, or maybe places where do you know what they're doing, any pilots anywhere, anything like that outside of Washington?
So I think one example that we've heard of is the Department of Defense is running a pilot on Fort Bragg, where Fort Bragg hosts a lot of injured soldiers who have been hurt in combat, have suffered traumatic brain injuries, and they found that even though the barracks for these injured soldiers is relatively close to the medical facility, the rate of absenteeism for medical appointments is actually pretty high. So, and the issue is they would love to send people to to go ahead and pick these people up pick up injured soldiers from the barracks, but there's a certain cost associated with doing so. So they're actually right now have a pilot autonomous golf cart that is circulating between the medical facility and the barracks. And right now there's still a driver in it because we just went to one of the facilities that are building it, but they're hoping to take out the driver pretty soon out of that. And I think there's a broader point here. Autonomous vehicles don't have to look like today's cars. And in fact, to deliver the most benefit in terms of accessibility, we need the flexibility to make sure that we can design cars in ways that are accessible. So right now, you have to retrofit a car to make it wheelchair accessible, for example, or some of the interfaces are not usable by people who have who are deaf or blind. So when you start to rethink how to build a car, you can start to build it from the ground up, be more accessible, and one of the provisions in some of this legislation makes it easier for AV developers, for people who are building autonomous vehicles, to be more flexible about design principles and start to think about how you build accessibility from the ground up.
Sure.
So I think we're going to see a lot more experimentation in this regard, but these are going to be unconventional shuttle-type vehicles. There'll be a lot of unconventional shuttle-type vehicles, and this sort of flexibility will be important.
And there is one company that's doing some really interesting things around low-speed autonomous bus sort of thing called Ollie. Local Motors is the company, so I recommend if you're interested in looking into what they're doing to check it out. But they're doing some really interesting things. And then there are places like Pennsylvania and Arizona that are cordoning off zones that are pilot zones, essentially, for autonomous vehicle deployment and trying to gather that critical data we need, miles driven, and how often does a human need to intercede and take over manual control, for example, is a really critical data point, because that's how we can start to figure out how can we get from level 2, level 3 to the truly autonomous level 4 and level 5, which is the level at which people like me, blind folks, and other people with disabilities who can't get traditional driver's license will be able to actually use these vehicles.
Sure.
I want to have one more point, which is really important for the local transportation planner audience on the webinar. In order to make advances on using autonomous vehicle technology to increase accessibility, you don't need to wait for advanced level 4 and level 5 autonomy. There already is technology today that can pilot or can travel autonomously in limited zones or in fixed routes, and it would be really good if people could think creatively about how we take these pieces of technology which are already available and add it to your system in a way that improves accessibility. Thinking about what some companies are doing around autonomous shuttles in retirement communities comes to mind. So the point is, you don't have to wait for the technology to be perfect and to fulfill every ride. There's technology that's usable today.
Sure. It's moving so fast. Anyway, but I think your example on Fort Bragg is a good one. You think that it will probably take place in enclosed facilities like that. We can do a lot of testing, and the Defense Department's always been out in front in some of this stuff. So.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think it's right. I mean, a lot of the big companies are very focused on the broader consumer market. I think a lot of the really interesting things are going to happen on maybe slightly lower profile, but really important experimentation that happens in the margins on these closed campuses. So I would pay a lot of attention to those markets for those smaller experiments.
So here's a question. I'm going to preface it with, as you know, the conversation around autonomous vehicles, automated vehicles, focuses on this difference between shared use vehicles and the ownership model. There's different firms have different models. This is a big part of the debate within this community. There's a question that's come in. It's actually really for you, Dylan. So given how you've talked about how this can enhance folks that you've in your orbit, am I to understand that NFB is focused mainly on the path of ownership so that blind people can become more independently mobile, versus the model, this mobility on demand model, where you can call up a vehicle on demand and more of the shared use model? Do you have a perspective on which one's better for your members?
I wouldn't say necessarily one or the other is better. What I would say is that from everything we're hearing from industry, and we do a lot of work with the auto industry, especially in the context of our membership in the Coalition for Future Mobility, everything we're hearing is that the initial phase of deployment is going to be primarily ride-sharing and fleet model. So we're not going to get to an get to an individual private ownership model where, let's say me, you know, blind guy X is going to walk down to the dealership and have my own autonomous vehicles there to purchase, right? Now that's something that perhaps down the road we can anticipate and contemplate, but right now, and I think in the foreseeable future, we are more in that kind of ride-sharing fleet model, which is great. I mean, we are able to do that now. For example, I took a major ride-sharing service over here. I'm not going to name it because we're not buzz marketing here, right? But I took one over here and it was fine. I did it completely independently because the technology exists for me to use a smartphone to order one of these things, and that's fine. But there is still a cost associated with that, and from everything we're hearing and all the reports I'm reading anyway, the cost per mile in the ride-sharing model when it's fully autonomous is going to be substantially lower, which is going to help because in the disability community, the blind community as well, we have a high incidence of low income status. So the cheaper we can make transportation beyond the access and the reliability and the predictability factors, the cheaper we can make it, the better. And I think that's a really positive thing we can look forward to.
Sure, and a very important consideration, and this actually is a question that just came in, kind of related. It's asking, can anyone speak to the use of AVs and the reliance on being banked to use the business model being offered? What about people with disabilities that are unbanked? How can they use AVs to subscribe to one of these ownership models that requires the user to be banked? With your point being that a lot of folks are low income, they may not be banked, or I don't even know how you think about that.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question, and one that we still need to tackle and try to figure out. You know, I mean, I think not having a smartphone is definitely a good question, and we're already seeing that some of the current ride-sharing companies are doing things like allowing you to use a regular landline phone to call and to order one of their cars to where you are. So that could be a way to get around this. But I mean, that is definitely a piece of this that we have to think through more to figure out how we can truly penetrate. And we also need to consider how much people with disabilities are trapped in place, right? So think about blind folks, for example, who live in rural settings. We are essentially trapped, or we're utterly reliant on other people's schedules to get to where we need to go. So if a blind person who lives in a rural setting, for example, is able to have a landline that they can call into a service and get an autonomous vehicle there, all of a sudden you enhance their independence and their dignity and their opportunity to engage. So,
sure.
I mean, it's all connected. You know?
Got it. So, I mean, kind of sticking with that team a little bit about you talk rural areas. Are there any downsides here? When we think about AVs, we think about how AVs are being tested and how they interact on city streets. Clearly, there's benefits from reduction in traffic deaths. But how about the interaction with pedestrians on city streets, and particularly in urban areas, particularly blind folks? Is there a concern there? Is there anything that worries you about AVs versus pedestrians who have visual disabilities?
Yes, so there is an issue there too, and I'm glad you brought that up because we've actually done a lot of work in recent years when it came to the quiet car phenomenon. As soon as we started seeing hybrids and electric vehicles hit the road, we started seeing a dramatic uptick.
The quiet car, because the vehicle you can't hear.
Exactly, you can't hear them, and obviously you can't see them if you're blind. So we worked with the auto industry to get something called the Pedestrian Safety Enhancement Act passed, which was implementing some regulations around quiet cars needing to have functions and features that allow blind people and frankly all pedestrians, it's not just blind people. If you're a slightly distracted person who isn't blind, you still might not hear that very quiet car. So that's something that we would need to think about around autonomous vehicles too. We would need to make sure that in the same way we're contemplating that when it comes to electric vehicles, we need to think about having some kind of an auditory feature. Also, wayfinding is the term of art right now. So how does a blind person, for example, who calls an autonomous vehicle via ride sharing, how do we track down the vehicle that has come to us, let's say in a parking lot or on a crowded, busy street? So this idea of wayfinding. So the idea would be I have a button I can push on my phone that makes the car beep or make the car make some kind of a noise, right? So all of this technology already exists. I just want to make it clear, we're not reinventing the wheel here. Like all of this stuff is there. It's being used in other contexts. So we just need to take what's already there, the innovation, the ingenuity that we already have, and just apply it to this issue.
Got it. And we're getting a ton of questions. I'm going to try to tick through a couple of these quickly. And it's a little related to that last one. What needs to happen at the curbside to enable people with disabilities to unload and load from an autonomous vehicle?
So I did just mention wayfinding, so I won't repeat that. But I think, and this is something that we with the National Federation of the Blind don't have the expertise or authority to really speak to, but I can imagine a scenario in which you would want there to be specific parts of curbs that are designated as pickup zones. That way, let's say, for example, a wheelchair user could get out of their fully accessible, we hope, autonomous vehicle and be able to get onto the curb immediately right where they are, or pick them up right there at that same spot, right? But that's something that, as far as the National Federation of the Blind is concerned, we aren't in that space quite so much because it's not as relevant to us.
Yeah, it seems like it's picking up some speed with this, especially cities thinking about how we use the curb and how all these mobility on demand elements kind of start to play out. So maybe we'll connect with that.
So, I mean, I'm going to make a general comment based on what I've heard in a lot of the last few questions. A lot of questions seem to be coming in specifically about one specific investment that needs to be made, whether it's about curb space or reaching people who are unbankable. Well, one of the things that surprised me most when we did our study was just how large the market was for mobility for people with disabilities. There's a large population of people out there who need rides, and what surprised me is how little information there is about serving them through the private market. Now, when you have a lot of people who are needing rides, there certainly could be a way to flow private sector investments in order to meet some of those demands. Yet, the most recent government survey, which is our best source of information for the mobility needs of people with disabilities, is 14 years old. So I think there's a lot of room for a market-level study of what sort of demand there is from the market of people with disabilities. It's certainly going to be even larger if you also look at the group of the aging population. And I think there needs to be some thinking about what sort of investments there need to be in order to serve these markets. And we might find that there's actually a way to reach that with the market, with some sort of combination of market and policy.
Sure. Right. We're talking about a very specific slice of the debate here. When this is, especially here at ENO and SAFE, and you all are working on this, it's such an enormously important issue right now, very popular. One question, I hadn't thought about this, and if it's part of your report, but how does this affect vehicle insurance in the future? Is there any kind of play out at all with that?
Sure, I think as this new technology comes into the market, I think it's going to shift how paratransit works, or normal models of operation for transportation for people with disabilities. So we might see current models of paratransit where you have one driver and one aide shift to where there's one driver. And as we see vehicles become more expensive or more niche, that might impact how we finance the building of specific vehicles. If someone's going to contract a specially designed vehicle that's based on universal design and more accessible, we're going to see a shift of the vehicle market from mass production to more niche production, and the whole way that the automotive market is currently financed will need to be shifted, including the insurance aspect of it.
But nothing specific for people with disabilities. You think it doesn't play out any differently?
I mean, I think it's part of a much broader story of how do you insure on-demand rides, like rides that are sold by the mile rather than by the vehicle. How you tie that to usage. I think it's tied to the increasing value of the car, and therefore you have more to insure versus the change in the collision rate. I think those are going to be the bigger drivers of the story. And then, but I think we work with some providers of paratransit who serve on our board, and they're certainly thinking about some things have to happen in terms of operating model that might need some sort of regulatory considerations if you want to reduce the number of staff on a vehicle. So I think I would look at some of those trends.
Sure. Well, look, we're right about 4:30. I want to be respectful for folks' time. We got a lot of questions in here. We couldn't get to hardly all of them. I do want to mention one, something that just popped up, so that there are a lot of resources for folks they can look at. Clearly, you should look at that SAFE's report. It was released earlier this year on your website, I believe. You can get it on SAFE's website. There's also resources with the FTA. They've invested in national technical assistance centers to support mobility access for people with disabilities and older adults, such as the National Center for Mobility Management and the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center. Both are at Easter Seals. We can get some of these resources to folks. We can put them up on the website as well. But I think there are a lot of things for Clue. There's a lot of interest in this topic, and I really want to thank you both for being here today and for fielding all these questions. And I want to thank everybody for their participation on the call. We're going to stay involved in this issue at the Eno Center, particularly as it relates to autonomous vehicles and these broader societal impacts. If you'd like more information about Eno, you can check out our website at www.enotrans.org. I also want to encourage you to subscribe to Eno Transportation Weekly, an invaluable resource on all these aspects of transportation policy and practice. So, Dylan, Amitai, thank you very much for joining us here today. Thank you all for your participation. Have a great afternoon, everybody.